Sometimes a stranger's desperation can break your heart in ways you never expected. When a young woman approached mountain man Cyrus Blackwell in the fading Colorado twilight, offering to sell her father's knife for food money, he couldn't say no to those hollow, hungry eyes. The blade was beautiful work, hand-forged with an elk bone handle, and she needed the $5 more than he needed to keep his money. But when Cyrus examined the knife closer, his blood ran cold. The maker's mark etched into the steel belonged to his own brother, the brother he'd driven away 30 years ago after a bitter family feud. This starving girl was his niece, selling her dead father's memory just to buy bread for her grandmother. The knife wasn't just a family heirloom. It was proof of the terrible price his pride had cost. What choice would you make when faced with the consequences of your past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered photograph lay face down in the bottom drawer of Cyrus Blackwell's rough-hewn pine chest, buried beneath spare ammunition and old letters he'd never quite found the courage to burn. In that faded daguerreotype, two young men stood shoulder to shoulder against a backdrop of Colorado mountains, their faces bright with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the world holds endless possibilities. Cyrus hadn't looked at that picture in 15 years, but he could still see it clearly in his mind's eye himself at 25, lean and eager, standing next to his brother Jeremiah, whose calloused hands already showed the promise of the master blacksmith he would become. Now, at 58, Cyrus lived alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands, high in the Colorado Territory, where the thin air made every breath deliberate and the silence stretched so wide a man could lose himself in it. His hair had gone silver white, and deep lines mapped the geography of 3 decades spent squinting into mountain sun and winter storms. His hands, once smooth like his brother's, now bore the permanent stains of gunpowder and the scars of 100 small accidents that came with living entirely by one's own skill and providence. The cabin itself reflected its builder's practical nature: solid log walls, chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace that drew well, and windows positioned to catch the morning light while avoiding the harsh afternoon glare that could blind a man at this elevation. Cyrus had chosen this location with the same careful consideration he applied to everything else in his solitary life. The site offered fresh water from a spring that never froze, timber for fuel and repairs, and sightlines in every direction that would give him ample warning of any unwanted visitors. Few visitors came. The closest settlement, a rough collection of buildings, called Cedar Falls, lay 8 miles down a treacherous mountain trail that discouraged casual travel. When Cyrus did venture into town, perhaps once every few weeks, it was for supplies he couldn't make or hunt himself: salt, coffee, ammunition, and the occasional bottle of whiskey that helped quiet the voices of memory on particularly long winter nights. The people of Cedar Falls knew him as a reliable man who kept his word, paid his debts in cash or trade, and never stayed longer than necessary to conduct his business. They called him polite but distant, the kind of fellow who would tip his hat to a lady and help a stranger fix a broken wagon wheel, but who never lingered for conversation or accepted invitations to supper. What they didn't know, what Cyrus had never told a living soul, was that his isolation wasn't born of misanthropy or shyness, but of a guilt so deep and persistent that it had shaped 30 years of his life like water carving stone. The guilt had a name, and that name was Jeremiah Blackwell. Their father, William Blackwell, had been a practical man who understood that the Colorado Territory in 1850 was no place for family sentiment to override common sense. When consumption took him at 62, he left behind 200 acres of good mountain land, a modest cabin, and 2 sons who had worked that land together since they were old enough to swing an axe. The will, read by the circuit preacher who doubled as the territory's informal legal authority, was simple. The land would go to Cyrus, the elder son, with the understanding that Jeremiah would always have a home there and a say in its management. At the time, the arrangement had seemed perfectly reasonable. Cyrus was indeed the elder, by 3 years, and he had always shown more interest in hunting and trapping, the skills that would be essential for maintaining a mountain homestead. Jeremiah, meanwhile, had discovered an almost mystical talent for working iron, turning raw metal into tools and implements that were both beautiful and supremely functional. The brothers had planned to build their futures together, Cyrus managing the land and hunting grounds, Jeremiah establishing a smithy that would serve the growing number of settlers filtering into the territory. For 2 years, the arrangement worked exactly as their father had intended. Cyrus improved the cabin, expanded the cleared land, and established trap lines that provided both meat and pelts for trade. Jeremiah built his forge in a stone shed near the creek, where the sound of his hammer rang across the valley from dawn to dusk. They worked in harmony, shared meals and stories, and even began talking about the families they might someday start. Then came the winter of 1852, and with it a series of events that would fracture their brotherhood beyond repair. The trouble began with a woman named Catherine Murphy, the 19-year-old daughter of a settler family that had arrived in the territory the previous spring. Catherine was beautiful in the way that mountain women often were: practical, strong, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding about the hardships of frontier life. Both brothers noticed her, though neither spoke of it initially. She began visiting the homestead to commission work from Jeremiah: kitchen knives, hardware for doors and cabinets, small items that gave her excuses to spend time near his forge. Cyrus told himself he didn't mind. After all, Catherine was clearly drawn to Jeremiah's artistic skills and gentle manner. But as winter deepened and Catherine's visits became more frequent, something ugly began growing in Cyrus's chest. He found himself watching their conversations, noting the way Catherine's laugh carried across the yard when Jeremiah said something amusing, observing how her eyes followed his brother's movements as he worked the hot iron. The breaking point came on a February morning when Cyrus returned from checking trap lines to find Catherine and Jeremiah sitting close together on the porch, sharing coffee and talking in the low, intimate tones that lovers use. They weren't touching, weren't doing anything improper, but Cyrus saw in their posture and expressions something that hit him like a physical blow. They were falling in love, and he was the outsider looking in. That night, after Catherine had gone home and Jeremiah had retired to his room, Cyrus sat by the fire nursing a bottle of whiskey and nursing his wounded pride. He was the elder brother, the landowner, the one who should have had first claim on any woman's affections. The whiskey amplified every slight he had ever felt, every moment when Jeremiah's quick wit or artistic talent had overshadowed his own steady competence. By morning, fueled by alcohol and self-pity, Cyrus had convinced himself that his brother was taking advantage of his generosity, using the home and workshop Cyrus provided to court the woman Cyrus himself had wanted. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Cyrus waited until Jeremiah had finished his morning coffee, then announced that the arrangement wasn't working anymore. He claimed that having a smithy on the property was bringing too many strangers around, that the noise interfered with his hunting, that he needed the space for other plans. All lies, but delivered with the cold authority of a man who held the legal title to everything around them. Jeremiah had stared at his brother in stunned silence for a long moment before asking the question that still echoed in Cyrus's memory 3 decades later. What about Catherine? What about her? Cyrus had replied with deliberate cruelty. If she wants to see you, she can visit wherever you decide to set up shop, assuming you can afford to set up shop somewhere else. The hurt in Jeremiah's eyes had been immediately replaced by something harder, a recognition that the brother he had trusted and loved had chosen pride over family. Without another word, Jeremiah had packed his tools and few personal belongings into a wagon and driven away. He left behind the forge he had built with his own hands, the life he had planned to share with Cyrus, and the easy companionship that had sustained them both through their father's death and the challenges of frontier living. Catherine Murphy had left the territory with her family the following spring, but not before making it clear to anyone who would listen that she wanted nothing to do with either Blackwell brother. Cyrus learned later that she had been heartbroken by the family's dissolution, having seen in Jeremiah and Cyrus's partnership the kind of stable, loving foundation she had hoped to join. Instead, she found herself caught in the middle of a feud she didn't understand and wanted no part of. In the years that followed, Cyrus heard occasional news of his brother through the network of traders and travelers who moved through the territory. Jeremiah had established himself as blacksmith in various settlements, always moving on after a year or two, never quite settling down. There were reports that he had married a woman named Sarah in a town called Millfield, that they had a daughter, that his work was highly regarded wherever he went. But as the years passed, even these second-hand reports became fewer and more uncertain. Cyrus told himself he didn't care. He had built a good life on the land his father had left him. He was known throughout the territory as an honest trader and skilled hunter. His trap lines produced enough income to live comfortably, and his isolation protected him from the complications that came with close relationships. He convinced himself that he had made the right choice, that the property was better off in his sole control, that Jeremiah had probably found greater success on his own than he ever would have achieved staying on the family land. But late at night, when the mountain wind moaned through the trees and the fire burned low in the stone hearth, Cyrus sometimes found himself remembering the sound of Jeremiah's hammer ringing against the anvil, the easy conversations they had shared over evening meals, the way his brother's face would light up when he spoke about some new technique he wanted to try, or some particularly challenging piece a customer had commissioned. Those memories were why the photograph remained face down in the bottom drawer. They were why Cyrus had never married, never built the larger family his father had probably envisioned when he left the land to his elder son. They were why, despite 30 years of telling himself he had no regrets, the sight of that knife's maker's mark had hit him like a blow to the chest. Now, as he sat in his cabin with Jeremiah's knife on the rough pine table before him, Cyrus finally admitted to himself what he had been avoiding for 3 decades. He had destroyed his family over nothing more than wounded pride and jealousy. He had driven away the person who mattered most to him in the world, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to convince himself that the loss didn't matter. The girl who had sold him the knife, his niece, Jeremiah's daughter, had looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. The old woman with her, presumably Jeremiah's widow, had been so frail she could barely walk. They were family, his family, and they were starving while he lived in comfortable isolation on land that should have been their inheritance as much as his. Cyrus picked up the knife and examined it more closely in the lamplight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing all the skill and artistry that had made Jeremiah's work famous throughout the territory. The blade was perfectly balanced, the edge sharp enough to split hairs, the handle carved with a pattern of intertwined vines that seemed to flow like water across the bone surface. But what struck Cyrus most was a small detail he had missed in his initial shock. A tiny D carved into the base of the handle, almost hidden among the decorative patterns. D for Delilah, perhaps. His brother had made this knife for his daughter, probably taught her to use it, maybe even hoped to pass along his smithing skills along with the family name. Instead, she was selling her father's gifts to buy bread for her grandmother. The thought made Cyrus's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ride into Cedar Falls and ask questions. Someone there would know about the 2 women, would have seen which direction they had gone when they left town. He would find them, and he would find a way to help them without revealing who he was or stirring up painful memories of the family feud that had scattered them all. It was the least he could do for the brother, whose forgiveness he would never be able to seek, and for the family he had never known he had. The ride to Cedar Falls took Cyrus through familiar territory, but everything seemed different in the grey morning light. The pine-scented air that usually cleared his mind now felt heavy with possibility and dread. His horse, a steady mare named Patience, picked her way down the rocky trail with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that had made this journey dozens of times. But today, Cyrus barely noticed the familiar landmarks, the lightning-split oak, the creek crossing where he always paused to water, Patience, the outcropping of red stone that marked the halfway point to town. His mind was fixed on the conversation he planned to have with Martha Hendricks, the proprietress of Cedar Falls' only boarding house. Martha had run the establishment for 20 years and possessed the kind of encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip that made her more valuable than the territorial newspaper. If two women had passed through Cedar Falls in recent days, particularly two women in desperate circumstances, Martha would know about it. Cedar Falls itself was a modest collection of buildings that had grown organically around a natural ford in Cedar Creek. The main street consisted of Hendricks's boarding house, a general store, a saloon that doubled as the town's informal meeting hall, and a blacksmith shop that had stood empty since old Henrik Mueller died the previous winter. At the far end of town sat a small white church that served the spiritual needs of settlers scattered across 50 square miles of mountain territory. Cyrus tied Patience to the hitching post in front of the boarding house and paused for a moment to organize his thoughts. He needed information, but he also needed to be careful not to reveal too much about his own interest in the women. Martha Hendricks was a kind soul, but she was also a natural gossip who would find it impossible to keep such an intriguing story to herself. The boarding house door chimed as he entered, and Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was a woman of 60, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Despite her tendency toward gossip, Cyrus had always found her to be fundamentally decent, the kind of person who would feed a hungry stranger even if she couldn't afford to lose the money. "Cyrus Blackwell," she said with genuine warmth. "What brings you to town so early in the week? Not your usual supply run, is it?" "No, ma'am," Cyrus replied, removing his hat. "I'm actually hoping you might help me with some information. I had an encounter yesterday evening with two women, a young lady and an elderly woman, grandmother and granddaughter by the looks of them. They seem to be in difficult circumstances, and I've been wondering if they might have passed through town recently." Martha's expression immediately grew concerned. "Oh, you must mean Delilah and Constance. Yes, they stayed here 3 nights, poor things. I've rarely seen folks in such desperate straits." She gestured toward the small dining area adjacent to the front desk. "Sit down, and I'll tell you what I know. Can I get you some coffee?" Cyrus accepted the offer and settled into one of Martha's mismatched chairs. The boarding house dining room was warm and welcoming, decorated with quilts Martha had made herself, and furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than style. It was the kind of place where a person could feel at home, which made the story Martha began to tell all the more heartbreaking. "They arrived on foot," Martha began, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup of coffee. "The young woman Delilah was supporting the older one, and I could see they'd been walking for days. The grandmother, Constance, was so weak she could barely speak. Delilah had exactly 37 cents when she asked about a room, poor child." "Did they say where they were coming from?" Cyrus asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Millfield, originally. Delilah told me her father died about 2 years ago, and they'd been struggling ever since. Apparently, he was a blacksmith, quite well regarded, but when he passed, they lost the shop and most of their belongings to debts. They've been moving from town to town, looking for work, but Constance's health keeps getting worse." Cyrus felt his chest tighten. Millfield was where he'd heard Jeremiah had settled. The timeline matched perfectly with what he knew of his brother's life. What kind of work was Delilah looking for? Anything she could find. She's got some skill with metalwork learned from her father, she said, but most places aren't inclined to hire a woman for that kind of work. She was willing to take in washing, clean houses, work in the general store, anything honest. But with Constance so sick, she couldn't commit to regular hours. Martha paused to sip her coffee, and Cyrus could see the sympathy in her eyes. I let them stay for free the first night. How could I not? But I can't run a charity, much as I'd like to. I told Delilah she could work off their room and board by helping with the cooking and cleaning, but Constance took a turn for the worse on the second day. What happened? Fever, terrible coughing fits. The poor woman could barely catch her breath. Delilah was beside herself, wanting to call for Doc Morrison, but she didn't have money for a doctor's visit. I finally convinced her to let me send for him anyway, told her we'd work something out later. Cyrus leaned forward. What did the doctor say? Consumption, most likely, though he couldn't be certain without more time to observe her. Said she needed rest, proper nutrition, and medicine if they could afford it. The medicine alone would cost more than those two had seen in months. Martha shook her head sadly. Doc Morrison's a good man. He left some basic remedies and said he'd check on Constance without charge, but there's only so much he can do without payment. So they left? Had to. Constance was stable enough to travel, and Delilah said they couldn't impose on my kindness any longer. She offered to leave some of their possessions as payment for the room, but I couldn't take what little they had left. Martha stood and walked to a small cabinet near the window, though I did convince her to leave this behind. She returned with a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. When she unwrapped it, Cyrus saw a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. His heart began to pound as he recognized his brother's careful handwriting on the top envelope. Letters from her father, Martha explained. Delilah said she'd been carrying them everywhere, but they were getting damaged from travel. I promised to keep them safe until she could come back for them, though Lord knows when that might be. May I? Cyrus asked, gesturing toward the letters. Martha hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to look at the top one. Maybe there's something that would help us figure out how to find them. With trembling hands, Cyrus picked up the bundle. The top letter was addressed simply to "My dearest Delilah" in Jeremiah's familiar script. Through the thin paper, he could make out fragments of his brother's words. Your Uncle Cyrus, family land in the mountains, hope that someday. The sight of his own name in his brother's handwriting hit Cyrus like a physical blow. Jeremiah had written to his daughter about him, had perhaps even hoped for some kind of reconciliation. The magnitude of what he had lost, what they had all lost, threatened to overwhelm him. Are you all right? Martha asked, noticing his sudden pallor. Cyrus carefully rewrapped the letters and handed them back to her. I'm fine. Just thinking about those poor women. Do you know which direction they went when they left? North, toward the mining camps. Delilah heard there might be work there, though I tried to warn her about the kind of men she'd encounter in those places. A young woman traveling with a sick elderly woman. Martha shook her head. I've been worried sick about them. How long ago did they leave? Day before yesterday, early morning. They couldn't have gotten far, not with Constance in her condition. Martha looked at Cyrus with sudden interest. You're not thinking of going after them, are you? Cyrus stood and placed his hat back on his head. I might know someone who could help them, he said carefully. If I do find them, would you be willing to take them back? I'd be happy to cover their expenses. Martha's face brightened. Of course. Those two need proper care, especially Constance. And Delilah's a sweet girl, hard-working and respectful. If someone could just give them a chance to get back on their feet, I'll do what I can, Cyrus promised. He pulled out his wallet and placed $10 on the table. This should cover their previous stay and hold a room for them if I can convince them to, and return. As he turned to leave, Martha called after him. Mr. Blackwell, if you do find them, tell Delilah that her father's letters are safe here. I think it would comfort her to know that. Outside, Cyrus untied Patience and stood for a moment in the morning sun, trying to process everything he had learned. His brother was dead, had been dead for 2 years, while Cyrus lived in ignorance just 50 miles away. Jeremiah's widow and daughter were wandering the territory in desperate poverty, unaware that they had family who could help them. And somewhere in those letters, Martha was protecting lay words his brother had written about him, perhaps words of forgiveness or hope for reconciliation that Cyrus would never have the chance to answer. The North Road out of Cedar Falls led into some of the roughest country in the territory, a landscape of mining camps and temporary settlements populated by men who had left civilization behind in pursuit of quick wealth. It was no place for two. Vulnerable women, especially with winter approaching and Constance in such poor health. Cyrus mounted patience and turned toward the North Road. He had lost 30 years to pride and stubbornness, but he wouldn't lose another day. Somewhere ahead, his family was in danger, and for the first time since that bitter morning in 1852, Cyrus Blackwell was going to put family before pride. The letters his brother had written about him would have to wait. First, he had to find the living legacy Jeremiah had left behind and somehow make amends for 3 decades of silence. The North Road from Cedar Falls quickly deteriorated from a well-maintained wagon path to little more than a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside by countless pack animals and determined prospectors. Cyrus followed the trail with the methodical patience of a man who had spent decades tracking game through difficult terrain, reading the subtle signs that most travelers would miss entirely. Here, the deeper impressions left by someone walking with uneven steps, likely Constance, favoring one leg over the other. There, a small piece of blue fabric caught on a thorny bush at exactly the height where it would snag someone supporting another person's weight. Every few hundred yards, Cyrus found evidence that 2 women had passed this way recently, moving slowly and stopping frequently to rest. The higher elevation brought cooler air and the sharp scent of pine, but it also meant thinner atmosphere that would make every step more difficult for someone already weakened by illness. Cyrus couldn't help but admire Delilah's determination, even as he worried about the challenges they were facing. The girl was pushing herself and her grandmother through country that challenged even experienced mountain men, driven by nothing more than hope and desperation. As patience carried him steadily upward, Cyrus found his mind drifting to memories he had kept buried for years. He remembered teaching Jeremiah to track deer when they were boys, showing his younger brother how to read the forest signs that revealed where animals had passed and where they might be found. Jeremiah had been a quick learner, but his interests had always leaned more toward creation than hunting. Even as a child, he had preferred whittling wood into small figures to stalking game through the underbrush. Their father had recognized Jeremiah's artistic temperament early and had arranged for him to spend a summer with the territorial blacksmith when he turned 15. Cyrus remembered the excitement in his brother's eyes when he returned home, full of stories about working with fire and iron, about the almost magical process of shaping raw metal into useful, beautiful objects. It's like the metal wants to become something else, Jeremiah had explained one evening as they sat by the fire. You just have to listen to it, feel what it's trying to tell you, and help it find its proper shape. At the time, Cyrus had smiled indulgently at his brother's fanciful description. Now, decades later, he understood that Jeremiah had been describing the same intuitive connection to his craft that Cyrus felt when tracking animals or reading weather patterns. They had both inherited their father's practical intelligence, but it had manifested in different ways. The trail led through a narrow canyon where the walls rose so steeply that the sun barely penetrated to the rocky floor. In this shadowed passage, Cyrus found more definitive evidence of the women's passage, a place where someone had clearly sat down to rest, marked by a small depression in the sandy ground and a few drops of water that suggested Constance had been overcome by another coughing fit. Beside the resting spot, partially hidden under a flat stone, Cyrus discovered something that made his chest tighten with emotion. It was a small piece of leather with careful stitching around the edges, part of a knife sheath torn off and left behind either deliberately or by accident. The leather was well worn, but of obviously high quality, marked by the kind of craftsmanship that Jeremiah had always brought to everything he made. Cyrus turned the leather fragment over in his hands, noting the precise, even stitching and the way the leather had been treated to resist water and wear. This wasn't just functional work, it was art disguised as utility, exactly the kind of thing his brother had always excelled at creating. The knife sheath had probably been made to accompany the blade Delilah had sold to him, part of a set that represented her father's love and skill. The discovery filled Cyrus with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Even in poverty, even while fleeing from one failed opportunity to another, Delilah was carrying reminders of her father's craftsmanship. But she was also losing pieces of that legacy along the way, leaving fragments of her family's history scattered across the mountainous terrain like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. As he continued climbing, Cyrus encountered other travelers who had seen the two women. A grizzled prospector leading a string of pack mules confirmed that they had passed by his camp early that morning, moving slowly but steadily northward. The man had offered them water and a bit of jerky, which they had accepted gratefully. "The young one's got steel in her spine," the prospector told Cyrus. "But the old woman's in a bad way. Shouldn't be traveling in this country, especially with winter coming on. Told them they ought to turn back, find someplace warm to hole up for the season, but the girl said they didn't have anywhere to go back to." A few miles further up the trail, Cyrus met a family of settlers heading down from the mining camps with their worldly possessions loaded into a single wagon. The husband, a man named Peterson, had tried to convince Delilah and Constance to travel back to Cedar Falls with them. "We offered them space in the wagon," Peterson's wife explained to Cyrus. "The grandmother could barely walk, and you could see she was burning with fever. But the young woman said they had to keep moving north, said there might be work in the camps." "Did she say what kind of work?" Cyrus asked. Peterson shook his head grimly. "That's what worried us. Ain't much honest work for a woman in those mining camps, especially a young, pretty woman traveling without male protection. We tried to warn her, but she said she'd rather take her chances up there than starve down here." The conversation left Cyrus deeply troubled. He had heard stories about the mining camps' rough, lawless places where violence was common and women were seen as either property or prey. The thought of Delilah trying to find work in such an environment, while caring for a desperately ill grandmother, filled him with urgency. He pushed patience harder, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and check for signs of the women's passage. The trail grew, steeper and more treacherous as they climbed, and Cyrus found himself wondering how Delilah was managing to help Constance navigate the increasingly difficult terrain. Late in the afternoon, he discovered something that answered his question in the most heartbreaking way possible. At a particularly steep section of trail, he found clear evidence that the women had stopped for an extended rest. But more troubling were the marks in the dirt that suggested Delilah had been carrying her grandmother for part of the way, their combined weight leaving deeper impressions in the soft earth. Near this resting spot, Cyrus found another artifact that struck him like a blow, a small, leather-bound notebook with pages that had been carefully sewn together by hand. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and when he opened it, he found page after page of notes written in a neat, feminine hand. The notebook was clearly Jeremiah's work journal, documenting years of blacksmithing projects with detailed sketches and technical notes. But what made Cyrus's throat tight with emotion were the additions written in the margins, notes in Delilah's handwriting, observations about her father's techniques, questions about specific methods, and ideas for her own projects. "Father says the key to good steel is patience. Read one note. Let the metal cool naturally. Rushing the process makes it brittle." Another entry, dated just months before Jeremiah's death, revealed his hopes for his daughter's future. "Delilah shows real promise with detail work. Her hands are smaller than mine, better suited for delicate pieces. When she's ready, I'll teach her the secret of Damascus patterns." As Cyrus read through the journal, he realized he was looking at the record of a father passing his knowledge and passion to his daughter, preparing her to carry on the family craft. The notebook represented not just technical information, but love, hope, and the deep satisfaction Jeremiah had found in sharing his gifts with the next generation. The fact that Delilah had lost this precious record of her father's teachings, had probably dropped it while struggling to help her grandmother up the steep trail, spoke to the desperation of their situation. No one would willingly abandon such a treasure unless survival itself was at stake. The mining camp of Broken Creek sprawled across a narrow valley like a wound in the mountainside, a chaotic collection of tents, lean-tos, and hastily constructed wooden buildings that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense. Smoke from dozens of cook fires mixed with the acrid smell of blasting powder and the sour odor of men who worked hard and bathed rarely. Even from a distance, Cyrus could hear the constant noise, hammering, shouting, the grinding of machinery, and the occasional crack of gunfire that might signal celebration, conflict, or simple target practice. This was exactly the kind of place he had hoped never to find Delilah and Constance. Mining camps attracted desperate men from across the territory, men who had abandoned families, responsibilities, and often their better natures in pursuit of quick wealth. Violence was commonplace, law enforcement was minimal, and women were scarce enough to be treated as commodities rather than human beings. Cyrus guided patients down the rocky slope toward the camp's main street, keeping his eyes open for any sign of the two women. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the mountain air carried the constant din of activity. Prospectors moved back and forth between their claims and the camp's commercial district, their faces bearing the mixture of hope and exhaustion that characterized men gambling everything on the chance of striking it rich. Near the center of camp, Cyrus spotted what he was looking for, a small, neat tent pitched in the narrow space between two larger structures. Unlike the rough shelters around it, this tent showed signs of careful maintenance and feminine attention to detail. A small clothesline had been strung between tent stakes, and hanging from it were two sets of carefully mended undergarments and a worn but clean dress. As he watched, a young woman emerged from the tent, carrying a bucket toward the communal well. Even from a distance, Cyrus recognized her immediately, the same hollow cheeks and determined posture he had seen in the canyon twilight, but now marked by exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. Delilah moved with the careful efficiency of someone conserving energy for essential tasks, but her eyes constantly scanned the camp around her with the wariness of prey in predator territory. Cyrus dismounted and tied patients to a hitching post outside what appeared to be the camp's only legitimate boarding house. From this position, he could observe Delilah's movements without drawing attention to himself. He needed to understand their situation before deciding how to approach them. What he saw over the next hour filled him with both admiration and concern. Delilah made 3 trips to the well, each time carrying water back to the tent with careful precision. Between trips, she visited the camp's makeshift general store, where Cyrus watched her engage in what appeared to be a difficult negotiation with the proprietor. Even at a distance, he could see the man shaking his head repeatedly while Delilah gestured toward a small bundle of items she had brought to trade. Finally, the proprietor accepted something from her bundle. Cyrus couldn't see what in exchange for a small bottle that was almost certainly medicine. The transaction left Delilah visibly upset, but she clutched the bottle protectively as she made her way back toward the tent. It was then that Cyrus noticed the nearly empty medicine bottle sitting on a wooden crate near the tent's entrance, the artifact that told him everything he needed to know about Constance's condition. The bottle bore the label of a laudanum preparation, the kind of pain medication that doctors prescribed for serious illness, but that cost more than most working families could afford. The fact that it was nearly empty, combined with Delilah's desperate negotiation at the general store, told Cyrus that his family was facing a medical crisis, in addition to their financial difficulties. As evening approached, Cyrus watched Delilah emerge from the tent and walk toward a ramshackle building that appeared to serve as the camp's combination saloon and employment office. He followed at a discreet distance, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. Inside the building, oil lamps cast flickering shadows across a crowd of rough-looking men who were drinking, gambling, and conducting the kind of business that thrived in places where traditional law held little sway. Delilah stood out like a songbird among vultures, her neat appearance and respectful demeanor making her seem impossibly young and vulnerable. Cyrus watched through a grimy window as she approached a man behind a makeshift bar, apparently the establishment's owner or manager. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with the man shaking his head almost immediately and gesturing dismissively toward the door. Delilah persisted, and Cyrus could see her trying to explain something, probably describing her skills or experience. The man's response was a harsh laugh that Cyrus could hear even through the window. He said something that made several nearby customers turn to look at Delilah with expressions that made Cyrus's hand instinctively move toward his gun. The message was clear. There was no legitimate work for a woman in this camp, but there were other opportunities available if she was interested. Delilah's reaction was immediate and dignified. She drew herself up to her full height, said something sharp enough to wipe the smirk off the man's face, and walked toward the door with her, head held high. But Cyrus could see the defeat in her shoulders, the way her careful composure began to crack the moment she thought no one was watching. Outside the saloon, Delilah paused for a moment to collect herself, unaware that Cyrus was observing from the shadows. In that unguarded moment, he saw her youth and fear. Clearly, she was barely more than a girl, trying to care for a desperately ill grandmother in a place where danger lurked around every corner. As she began walking back toward their tent, Cyrus made a decision. He couldn't continue to watch from a distance while his family struggled and potentially faced harm. But he also couldn't simply reveal his identity and expect them to trust him. After 30 years of absence, he had no right to suddenly appear and claim the family connection he had rejected so long ago. Instead, he would start small. He would find ways to help them anonymously, to ease their immediate hardships while figuring out how to approach them properly. The camp's boarding house would be a good place to start gathering information and establishing himself as just another prospector or trader passing through. As Cyrus walked back toward Patience, he passed close enough to their tent to hear Constance's labored breathing and the soft sound of Delilah's voice, reading aloud, probably from one of her father's letters or perhaps from a book she had managed to keep despite their hardships. The intimate family scene, taking place in such harsh and dangerous surroundings, strengthened his resolve. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate process of inserting himself into their lives without revealing his true identity. He would become their mysterious benefactor, their stroke of good fortune in a place where luck was the only thing that kept people alive. And somehow, if he was careful and patient, he might find a way to earn forgiveness for 30 years of pride and stubbornness. The medicine bottle sitting outside their tent caught the last rays of sunlight, its emptiness a stark reminder of how little time he might have to make things right. Cyrus spent his first night in Broken Creek's boarding house, listening to the sounds of the mining camp, drunken laughter, occasional gunshots, and the steady rhythm of night shift workers heading to and from their claims. But what kept him awake was the memory of Constance's labored breathing and the image of Delilah's defeated shoulders as she left the saloon. By dawn, he had formulated a plan that would allow him to help without revealing his connection to them. The key was establishing himself as Thomas Garrett, a traveling trader with interests in metalwork and mining equipment. The false name came easily. Thomas had been their father's middle name, and Garrett was their mother's maiden name. It felt appropriate to use family names, even in deception, as he worked to heal family wounds. His first stop was the camp's general store, where he introduced himself to the proprietor, a sharp-eyed man named Coleman, who clearly served as the camp's informal information broker as well as its merchant. Cyrus explained that he was looking for skilled metal workers who might be interested in piecework, small jobs that could be done with basic tools for traders heading back to the settled territories. Metalwork? Coleman laughed. Friend, you're in the wrong place. These boys can barely sharpen their own pickaxes, let alone do fine metalwork. Closest thing we got to a skilled tradesman is old Murphy, and he's been too drunk to hold a hammer steady for the past 6 months. What about women? Cyrus asked casually. I've known some who learned the trade from their fathers. Coleman's expression grew more interested. Funny you should ask. Got a young woman came through yesterday, claimed she knew smithing. Course, I told her there wasn't call for that kind of work here, but if you're serious about paying for quality work, I might be. Where could I find her? Little tent over, between Morrison's claim shack and the old assay office. Girls caring for a sick grandmother. From what I hear. Name's Delilah something or other. Cyrus felt his pulse quicken at hearing his niece's name spoken aloud, but he kept his expression neutral. I'll talk to her. In the meantime, what kind of supplies do you carry for metalwork? The conversation that followed allowed Cyrus to accomplish several things at once. He purchased a selection of basic blacksmithing tools, hammer, tongs, files, and a small portable anvil, ostensibly for his own use, but actually planning to make them available to Delilah. He also bought medical supplies, including laudanum and fever-reducing powders, claiming he needed them for his own chronic condition. But the most important part of the transaction was arranging with Coleman to extend credit for the tent site and basic supplies to the young woman with the sick grandmother, with payment to come. From Cyrus's account, he spun a story about believing in supporting honest folks who were down on their luck, and Coleman, who was fundamentally a businessman, was happy to accommodate an arrangement that guaranteed payment. With his cover story established, Cyrus spent the morning observing the camp's rhythms and looking for opportunities to help without being detected. He noticed that Delilah made regular trips to the well, carrying water back to tend to her grandmother, and that she had to navigate increasingly aggressive attention from some of the camp's less savory residents. Around midday, he saw his first opportunity. Delilah had left their tent to fetch water, and Cyrus noticed that she had left Jeremiah's blacksmith tools sitting outside on a wooden crate, probably to air them out after the damp mountain journey. The tools were beautifully maintained, but showed signs of hard use. This was clearly a working set that had supported a family for years. The tools included a medium-weight hammer with a handle worn smooth by countless hours of use, a set of tongs with jaws shaped for specific tasks, several files of different grades, and various specialty tools that spoke to Jeremiah's skill and attention to detail. But what struck Cyrus most was the care with which they had been maintained. Despite their obvious poverty, Delilah had kept her father's tools clean, sharp, and ready for use. The metal showed no rust, the handles were tight, and each piece had been wrapped carefully for travel. While Delilah was at the well, Cyrus approached their tent with a casual air, as if he were simply exploring the camp. When he was certain no one was watching, he quickly placed the medical supplies he had purchased near the tent entrance, along with a small bag of food supplies and a note written in block letters. For the sick woman, from a friend who believes in helping decent folks. He was back at the boarding house when Delilah returned and discovered the supplies. From his window, he watched her reaction, initial wariness, then growing amazement as she examined the laudanum bottle and realized it was exactly what her grandmother needed. She looked around the camp suspiciously, trying to identify her mysterious benefactor, but Cyrus was careful to remain out of sight. That afternoon, he made his approach. He walked casually past their tent and struck up a conversation with Delilah as she sat outside, mending a torn piece of clothing. Up close, he could see the family resemblance more clearly. She had Jeremiah's intelligent eyes and their father's stubborn chin. But there was something uniquely her own in the way she carried herself, a combination of determination and grace that reminded Cyrus of their mother. "Excuse me, miss," he said, touching his hat brim politely. "I'm Thomas Garrett, and I understand you might have some skill with metalwork." Delilah looked up from her mending, her expression immediately cautious but hopeful. "I know some basic smithing, yes. My father was a blacksmith, and he taught me what he could before he passed. I'm a trader, and I often have need of small metal items, buckles, clasps, simple tools. The kind of work that doesn't require a full forge setup. Would you be interested in some piecework?" The hope that flashed across Delilah's face was almost painful to see. "Yes, sir, I would be very interested. I have my father's tools, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Excellent. Let me see what you can do with these." Cyrus produced a handful of raw metal stock he had purchased from Coleman. "Start with something simple, maybe a few belt buckles or knife handles. I'll pay fair wages for quality work." As they discussed the specifics of the arrangement, Cyrus found himself amazed by Delilah's knowledge and professionalism. She examined the metal stock with an expert eye, asked intelligent questions about his preferences for design and finish, and quoted reasonable prices for the work. It was clear that Jeremiah had passed on not just his technical skills, but his business sense and pride in craftsmanship. "There's one thing," Delilah said hesitantly. "My grandmother is quite ill, and I need to care for her. I can work when she's resting, but I may not be able to keep regular hours." "That's not a problem," Cyrus assured her. "Take the time you need. Good work is worth waiting for." The relief in her eyes was evident, and for a moment Cyrus thought she might cry. Instead, she composed herself and extended her hand for a businesslike handshake. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. This means more than you know." As Cyrus walked back to the boarding house, he reflected on the strange satisfaction of the afternoon. For the first time in 30 years, he was helping his family, even if they didn't know it. The work arrangement would provide Delilah with income and purpose, while allowing him to observe their situation and find additional ways to help. Over the following weeks, Cyrus found himself settling into the strange rhythm of helping his family while maintaining his carefully constructed deception. The work arrangement with Delilah had proven successful beyond his hopes. Her craftsmanship was exceptional, combining Jeremiah's technical precision with an artistic sensibility that was uniquely her own. Each piece she completed demonstrated not only skill, but genuine love for the craft. The family Bible that had traveled with them from Millfield sat on a small wooden crate inside their tent, and Cyrus caught glimpses of it during his visits to discuss work projects. The leather-bound volume was clearly old and well-used, its pages yellow with age and its binding soft from countless handlings. More importantly, it contained the complete Blackwell family tree, carefully maintained in faded ink on the front pages, a record that would immediately reveal his true identity if Delilah ever thought to examine it closely. The Bible represented everything that connected their scattered family: births, deaths, marriages, and the careful documentation of relationships that stretched back 3 generations. Cyrus knew that his own name appeared there, listed as Jeremiah's elder brother, along with their parents' names and the family's migration from Pennsylvania to the Colorado Territory. It was a ticking revelation that made every conversation with Delilah feel like walking across thin ice. Constance's health had stabilized somewhat with the regular medicine and better nutrition that Cyrus's anonymous gifts provided. On good days, she would sit outside the tent in a chair Delilah had fashioned from scrap wood, watching her granddaughter work and offering gentle guidance. Cyrus found excuses to visit during these times, drawn by the opportunity to observe the family dynamics he had missed for so many years. "Your grandmother seems to know a great deal about metalwork herself," he commented one afternoon as he watched Constance guide Delilah through a particularly complex joint on a decorative buckle. "Oh, yes," Delilah replied, not looking up from her work. "She was married to a blacksmith for 40 years before she married my grandfather. She taught my father almost as much as his master did. She must have wonderful stories about the trade." "She does indeed," Constance said, her voice still weak, but carrying the warmth of someone who enjoyed sharing memories. "I've seen metalwork evolve from crude frontier necessity to real artistry. My first husband, God rest his soul, could make a horseshoe that would last forever, but he couldn't make anything you'd call beautiful. Jeremiah was different. He had an eye for how function and beauty could work together." Cyrus felt his chest tighten at the casual mention of his brother's name. Jeremiah was Delilah's father. "A wonderful man," Constance continued, unaware of the emotional impact her words were having. "Skilled beyond measure, but more than that, he was kind, generous, always willing to help neighbors with their projects, even when he had more work than he could handle. He used to say that metalwork was like raising children. You put your best into them and hope they carry something good into the world." He sounds like he was well regarded. Oh, he was, but he carried some sadness too. He had a brother, older brother, that he'd been estranged from for years. Some family dispute over land, I believe. Jeremiah never talked about it much, but I know it weighed on him. He used to say he hoped someday they might reconcile. That family was too precious to waste on pride. Delilah looked up from her work. "I remember him writing letters sometimes that he never sent. He'd write them out carefully, then fold them up and put them away. When I asked him about it, he said he was practicing conversations he hoped to have someday." The revelation hit Cyrus like a physical blow. His brother had been writing unsent. Letters that might have been attempts at reconciliation, words of forgiveness or explanation that Cyrus had never received because Jeremiah had been too uncertain about whether they would be welcome. "Do you still have those letters?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Some of them. Most of our belongings were lost when we had to leave Millfield quickly, but I saved the most important things." Delilah gestured toward a small wooden box sitting near the Bible. "Father's letters, some of Mother's jewelry, a few tools that had special meaning." Cyrus found himself staring at that box, knowing it contained words his brother had written about him, possibly words of forgiveness or love that he desperately needed to hear. But he also knew that reading those letters would require revealing his identity, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that conversation. The mining camp itself was growing more dangerous as winter approached. The easily accessible gold was playing out, and desperation was making some of the miners reckless and violent. Just the previous week, there had been 3 shootings over disputed claims, and the camp's makeshift law enforcement was proving inadequate to maintain order. Cyrus had also noticed that Delilah was attracting increasingly unwelcome attention from some of the camp's rougher elements. Her skill with metalwork and her obvious intelligence made her stand out, and not always in ways that were safe for a young woman in such a lawless place. "Have you given any thought to where you'll spend the winter?" he asked during one of their work sessions. "These mountain camps can be brutal once the snow starts falling." Delilah's hands paused in their work. "We don't have many options, Mr. Garrett. Grandmother can't travel far in her condition, and we don't have money for passage to anywhere warmer. I was hoping to earn enough from metalwork to at least ensure we have adequate shelter and supplies." "What about family? Surely you have relatives somewhere who could help?" A shadow crossed Delilah's face. "Father had a brother, but they quarreled years ago, long before I was born. I don't even know if he's still alive, and even if he is, I wouldn't know how to find him. Father always said the quarrel was his fault as much as anyone's, but he never explained what it was about." Cyrus felt the weight of 30 years of separation pressing down on him. Here was his family, struggling and alone, because of a feud he could barely remember the original cause of. Pride, jealousy, wounded feelings, none of it seemed important now compared to the reality of Delilah's exhausted courage and Constance's failing health. Sometimes family quarrels seem more important than they really are, he said carefully. Time has a way of putting things in perspective. Maybe, Delilah replied, but some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Father used to say that some mistakes echo across generations, affecting the people who weren't even part of the original problem. That evening, as Cyrus sat in his room at the boarding house, he found himself staring at his own reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The face looking back at him was that of a stranger, weathered, worn, marked by 3 decades of solitude that he had chosen rather than accepting the vulnerability that came with family relationships. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the mining camp settling into another uneasy night. Somewhere in that collection of temporary shelters and desperate hopes, his family was bedding down in a tent that provided minimal protection against the approaching mountain winter. And they were doing it alone, unaware that the relative they thought was lost to them forever was sleeping just a few hundred yards away. The family Bible sat in their tent like a loaded weapon, ready to explode his carefully maintained deception. But perhaps, Cyrus thought as he prepared for bed, it was time to stop hiding behind false names and anonymous gifts. Perhaps it was time to find out whether 30 years had been long enough for forgiveness to grow in the space where anger used to live. The confrontation that would change everything began with the sound of raised voices outside the boarding house. Cyrus looked up from the letter he was writing, another attempt to find words that might explain 30 years of absence, and saw through his window a crowd gathering near Delilah and Constance's tent. Even from a distance, he could tell something was seriously wrong. He was downstairs and moving toward the commotion before he fully understood what was happening. As he got closer, he could see Delilah standing protectively in front of their tent, while 3 men in mining company uniforms gestured aggressively at a document one of them held. "You've got until tomorrow morning to clear out," the leader was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The Consolidated Mining Company has purchased mineral rights to this entire section, and we're expanding operations. All unauthorized structures need to be removed. But we paid our site fees," Delilah protested, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. "Mr. Coleman at the general store said we were good through the end of the month." "Coleman doesn't own this land, miss. The company does, as of 3 days ago. You and anyone else squatting here without proper authorization need to move along." Cyrus felt his jaw clench as he recognized the tone and tactics. He had seen mining companies use these methods before buying up land rights and then forcing out anyone who might interfere with their operations, often with minimal notice and no regard for the hardships they caused. "Where are we supposed to go?" Delilah asked, and Cyrus could hear the first note of desperation creeping into her voice. "My grandmother is seriously ill. She can't travel far, especially with winter coming." "Not our problem, miss. You've got until dawn." That was when Cyrus stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a way that the mining company men couldn't help but notice. "Gentlemen, there seems to be some confusion here." The leader turned toward him with the expression of someone unused to having his authority questioned. "And who might you be?" "Thomas Garrett. I'm a trader, and this young lady works for me. I wasn't aware that the mining company had any interest in this particular section." "Well, we do. Got the papers right here." The man waved the document. "Bought it fair and square from the territorial government." "May I see those papers?" The request was polite, but something in Cyrus's tone made it clear that it wasn't really a request. The mining company representative hesitated for a moment, then handed over the document with obvious reluctance. As Cyrus read through the legal language, he felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. The land deed wasn't just a simple purchase of mineral rights. It was a comprehensive claim that included surface rights, water rights, and timber rights for a section that extended far beyond the mining camp itself. More shocking was the description of the land boundaries. The section being claimed included not just the mining camp, but a significant portion of the mountain territory extending south towards Cedar Falls. If the legal description was accurate, the mining company was claiming ownership of land that included his own homestead land that had been in the Blackwell family for more than 30 years. "This is quite an extensive claim," Cyrus said carefully, handing the document back. "I assume you have clear title to all this territory?" "Course we do. Bought it from the rightful owner." "And who would that be?" The man consulted another set of papers. Jeremiah Blackwell inherited the land from his father, then sold his rights to the company before he died. All perfectly legal. Cyrus felt the world tilt around him. Jeremiah had owned rights to the family land. That was impossible. Their father's will had left everything to Cyrus as the elder son. Unless the realization hit him like a thunderbolt, unless their father had made a second will, or unless Jeremiah had somehow acquired legal rights to the property through some other means. The implications were staggering. "I'd like to see those ownership documents," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Now see here, mister. We don't have to show you. Actually, you do." Cyrus's tone had grown colder. "If you're claiming ownership of land in this territory, you need to be able to prove that claim to any interested party. That's territorial law." The mining company men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Finally, the leader produced a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. The first was indeed a deed of sale, signed by someone claiming to be Jeremiah Blackwell and dated just 6 months before his death. But as Cyrus read through the legal description of the property being sold, he realized something that made his chest tight with emotion and regret. Jeremiah hadn't sold the family homestead at all. According to the documents, he had sold his rights to a completely different section of land territory that he had apparently acquired through homestead claims and mining rights purchases over the years since leaving the family property. Jeremiah had built his own legacy, separate from the land their father had left to Cyrus. But there was more. Attached to the deed of sale was a copy of Jeremiah's last will and testament, and reading it, Cyrus felt his carefully constructed understanding of the past 30 years crumble completely. "I, Jeremiah Blackwell," the will read, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved daughter Delilah, with the exception of my rights to the original Blackwell family homestead, which I hereby leave to my brother Cyrus, in hopes that time has healed the wounds between us and that he will welcome his family home." Cyrus had to read the passage twice before its full meaning sank in. Jeremiah had never forgotten him. Even after 30 years of separation, even after the bitter words and broken family bonds, his brother had been thinking of reconciliation. The land that Jeremiah had sold to the mining company was separate property, but the original family homestead, the land Cyrus had been living on in isolation for 3 decades, had been left back to him in his brother's will. The original land deed that established these rights would be in the family Bible, the same Bible that sat in Delilah's tent just a few yards away. The Bible that contained the complete family tree, including Cyrus's own name, listed as Jeremiah's elder brother. "There seems to be some confusion about property. Boundaries," Cyrus said carefully to the mining company men. "I think we need to clarify exactly which sections you have rights to and which you don't. Look, mister, I don't know what your game is, but..." The conversation was interrupted by a weak voice from inside the tent. "Delilah, what's all the shouting about?" Constance emerged from the tent, leaning heavily on a walking stick, her face pale but her eyes alert. She took in the scene, the official-looking men, the tense postures, the documents, and her expression grew worried. "These men say we have to leave by morning, grandmother," Delilah explained. "They claim the mining company owns this land now." Constance's eyes moved to Cyrus, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who had lived long enough to recognize important moments when they arrived. For a long moment, she said nothing, just looked at him with growing recognition. "Thomas Garrett," she said slowly, as if testing the name. Then, more, quietly, or should I say, Cyrus Blackwell. The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water. Delilah's head snapped around to stare at Cyrus, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. The mining company men looked back and forth between them, uncertain what was happening, but sensing that the dynamics of the situation had just shifted dramatically. "I don't know what you're talking about," Cyrus said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. Constance smiled sadly. "You have your father's eyes and your mother's stubborn chin. I may be old and sick, but I'm not blind. You're Jeremiah's brother, the one he talked about, the one he hoped would forgive him someday." Delilah was staring at Cyrus, as if seeing him for the first time. "Uncle Cyrus?" she whispered. "But that's impossible. You're Thomas Garrett. You're a trader." "I'm both," Cyrus said quietly, the weight of 30 years of deception finally becoming too heavy to carry. "And I'm the biggest fool who ever lived." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything. The mining company men were forgotten, their legal documents suddenly irrelevant compared to the family drama unfolding before them. Delilah's face showed a mixture of emotions, shock, hurt, anger, and something that might have been hope. "You knew who we were," she said, her voice barely audible. "All this time, you knew we were your family, and you didn't tell us." "I was afraid," Cyrus admitted, "afraid you'd hate me for what I did to your father. Afraid I had no right to claim family after 30 years of pride and stubbornness." Constance stepped forward, her walking stick tapping against the rocky ground. "Jeremiah never hated you, Cyrus. He was hurt, yes, but he never stopped hoping you'd come home. That's why he left you the original family land in his will. He wanted you to know that forgiveness was always possible." As if summoned by her words, the family Bible seemed to glow in the family afternoon light, sitting on its wooden crate inside the tent. The artifact that had threatened to expose his deception had become the symbol of his brother's enduring love and hope for reconciliation. The revelation changed everything about their situation, but it also raised new questions about the mining company's claims and what rights they actually had to force anyone from their homes. The mining company men retreated in confusion, promising to return with reinforcements and legal authority, but their departure left behind a silence heavy with 30 years of unspoken words. Cyrus stood facing his family, his actual family, for the first time since that bitter morning in 1852, and found himself speechless in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or deception. Delilah's initial shock had crystallized into something harder. 30 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of questions. "You've been alive for 30 years while Father wrote letters he never sent, while he told me stories about the brother he missed, while he hoped every day that you might forgive him for some quarrel he could barely remember the cause of." "Delilah," Cyrus began, but she held up her hand. "No, let me finish." Her composure was remarkable, but Cyrus could see the pain beneath it. "Do you know what Father's last words were?" he said. "Tell Cyrus I'm sorry. Tell him the land was never worth losing family over." Her voice broke slightly. "I didn't even know how to find you to deliver that message." Constance moved slowly to a wooden crate and sat down heavily, the confrontation having drained what little strength her illness had left her. "There's something you both need to understand," she said quietly. "Jeremiah spent years trying to find the courage to reach out to you, Cyrus. He wrote dozens of letters, but he never sent them because he was afraid you still hated him." She gestured toward the small wooden box that contained their most precious possessions. "Show him the letters, Delilah. Show him what his brother really thought about their quarrel." With trembling hands, Delilah opened the box and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. She selected one from the middle of the stack and handed it to Cyrus without a word. The paper was yellowed with age, and Jeremiah's careful handwriting had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. "My dear brother Cyrus," it began, "I know I have no right to write to you after all these years, but I find myself thinking of you more and more as I watch my daughter grow. She has your stubborn streak and father's practical wisdom, and I wish you could meet her. I know our quarrel was as much my fault as yours. Young men's pride makes fools of us all. I've built a good life here in Millfield, but something has always been missing, and I think that something is my brother's friendship. If you ever find it in your heart to forgive me." The letter went on, for 2 pages, filled with updates about Jeremiah's life, his work, his hopes for Delilah's future, and his enduring regret about their estrangement. It was dated 15 years earlier, when Delilah would have been just a child. "There are dozens more like that," Constance said softly. "Letters he wrote but never sent, because he didn't know if you'd welcome them." He carried that regret until the day he died. Cyrus felt something breaking open in his chest, 30 years of carefully maintained emotional walls crumbling under the weight of his brother's forgiveness. "I thought he hated me," he whispered. "I convinced myself that driving him away was the right thing to do, that he was better off without me." "He never hated you," Delilah said, her anger beginning to soften into something more complex. "But he did miss you. Every time he talked about his childhood, about learning to work with metal, about father's lessons, your name was part of the story. You were part of who he was, even when you weren't there." The afternoon was growing late, and the sounds of the mining camp around them were changing as workers returned from their claims and the evening shift prepared to begin. But in the small space around their tent, time seemed suspended as 3 generations of the Blackwell family finally began to heal wounds that had festered for decades. "There's something else you need to know," Cyrus said, pulling the land deed from his jacket. "The mining company thinks they bought mineral rights from Jeremiah, but according to his will, he left the original family homestead back to me. That means they don't have any legal claim to the land where I've been living, land that's big enough to support all of us." Delilah took the deed and read through it carefully, her blacksmith's attention to detail serving her well as she parsed the legal language. "This says the homestead includes water rights and timber rights, as well as surface rights. If the mining company is trying to claim this territory, they're going to have a legal fight on their hands. More than that," Constance added, her voice growing stronger as she contemplated the implications. "If they're operating illegally on family land, they could be forced to compensate for any damage they've done to the property." As they discussed the legal ramifications, Cyrus found himself watching Delilah work through the problem with the same methodical intelligence he had seen her apply to metalwork. She was her father's daughter in more ways than one, skilled, thoughtful, and determined to find solutions, rather than simply accepting problems. "There's something I need to show you both," he said suddenly. "Something that belonged to your father." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew Jeremiah's unfinished ceremonial sword, the project that had been mentioned in his work journal. Delilah gasped when she saw it. The blade was roughly shaped but not yet polished, the tang ready for handle but still raw metal. It was clearly the work of a master craftsman, but it had been left incomplete. "Father started this just before he got sick," she said, running her fingers along the unfinished edge. "He said it was going to be a wedding present for me, for whenever I found someone worthy of marrying. He was going to teach me the secret of Damascus steel patterns, but he died before he could finish it." Cyrus completed gently. "How did you get this?" "I found it in his workshop after he passed. The landlord was going to sell everything for scrap to cover debts, but I convinced him to let me buy your father's tools and unfinished projects. I've been carrying this around for 2 years, not knowing how to find you to return it." The admission was another crack in the wall of deception, another small lie revealed. But it also showed something important, that even in his fear and pride, Cyrus had been trying to preserve his brother's legacy. "We could finish it together," Delilah said quietly, studying the sword's lines. "You know father's techniques, and I know his vision for the piece. It would be like having him work with us." The idea of completing Jeremiah's final project together felt like more than just metalwork. It felt like a way of honoring the brother Cyrus had lost and the father Delilah missed. It would also give them time to rebuild the trust that 30 years of separation had eroded. "There's a working forge at my homestead," Cyrus said. "Your father built it when we were young men, before our quarrel. It's been cold for 30 years, but the stonework is still sound." "A real forge," Delilah breathed, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "I haven't worked at a proper forge since father died. These small projects are fine, but for something like this," she gestured toward the sword, "you need real heat, real tools." "Then we'll go home," Cyrus said, the word home feeling strange and wonderful on his lips after so many years of thinking of the homestead as simply his place of exile. "We'll go home, and we'll finish your father's work together." But even as they made plans to leave the mining camp, they all understood that the mining company wouldn't simply accept the loss of what they thought were their rightful claims. The men who had confronted them that afternoon would return with more authority and probably more force, and the legal battle over the land rights would be just the beginning of their challenges. "They'll be back," Constance said, voicing what they were all thinking, "and they won't be interested in legal niceties when there's money at stake." "Let them come," Cyrus replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 30 years learning to defend what was his. "They're not the first people who've underestimated what a Blackwell will do to protect family." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the mining camp, 3 generations of the Blackwell family began the process of becoming a family again. There would be legal battles ahead, dangerous confrontations with the mining company, and the long work of rebuilding trust after 30 years of separation. But for the first time since that bitter morning in 1852, Cyrus Blackwell was no longer alone. And for the first time since her father's death, Delilah had family who could help her carry the weight of responsibility and loss. The ceremonial sword lay between them on the wooden crate, its unfinished blade catching the last light of day, a symbol of interrupted dreams that might finally be completed, and a reminder that some things are worth the patience to do properly. Dawn brought the sound of horses and heavy wagon wheels grinding across the rocky ground of the mining camp. Cyrus emerged from the boarding house to see a formidable convoy approaching 12 armed men, riding alongside a wagon loaded with surveying equipment and legal documents. At the head of the group rode a man in an expensive suit, whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to having his orders followed without question. The completed ceremonial sword hung at Cyrus's side, its blade now polished to mirror brightness, and its elk-bone handle carved with the intertwined vine pattern that had become the signature of Blackwell craftsmanship. They had worked through most of the night to finish it, 3 generations of the family laboring together over Jeremiah's old forge to complete what he had started. The sword represented more than just metalwork. It was proof that the Blackwell legacy could survive separation, loss, and even death. "That's him," Delilah said quietly, pointing toward the man in the suit. "That's Consolidated Mining's territorial manager, Bradford Morrison. Word is, he's never lost a land dispute." "Every man loses eventually," Cyrus replied, checking the load in his rifle. "The question is whether he's smart enough to recognize when he's beaten." Around them, the other residents of the mining camp were gathering to watch the confrontation. Most were simple prospectors who had no love for big mining companies, but they also understood the reality of territorial politics. Money and legal authority usually trumped individual rights, regardless of what was morally right. Morrison dismounted near the central area of the camp and gestured for his men to spread out in a formation that looked casual but was clearly designed for intimidation. The surveyor began setting up his equipment while Morrison's legal assistant arranged documents on a portable table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison called out in a voice trained for public speaking, "I'm Bradford Morrison, representing Consolidated Mining Company. We have legal authority to claim this territory for mineral extraction, and we're prepared to compensate current residents for any improvements they've made to company land. What about people who already hold legal title to the land? Cyrus stepped forward, his hand resting on the sword's hilt. Morrison's eyes fixed on him with the calculating gaze of a man sizing up potential opposition. And you would be? Cyrus Blackwell. And this is my family's homestead territory, held by legal deed since 1848. I'm afraid that's impossible, Mr. Blackwell. Our records show that all land rights in this section were purchased from Jeremiah Blackwell before his death. Your records are incomplete. Cyrus produced the original land deed, along with a copy of Jeremiah's will. Jeremiah sold you rights to his personal claims, but the original family homestead was never his to sell. It belongs to me as the elder son, and according to his will, he confirmed that ownership. Morrison's legal assistant examined the documents with growing concern. After a whispered conference, Morrison's confidence appeared to waver slightly. Even if your claim has merit, Morrison said, the territorial government has the authority to claim land for economic development when it serves the greater good. We're prepared to offer you fair market value for your holdings. And if I refuse to sell, then we'll be forced to seek legal remediation through territorial courts. I should warn you that consolidated mining has significant influence with territorial judges. The threat was delivered politely, but its meaning was clear. Morrison expected to win through political connections and legal maneuvering, regardless of the actual merits of the case. That was when Constance spoke up from her chair near the tent. Despite her illness, her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived long enough to see through polite threats to the corruption beneath. Mr. Morrison, I've lived in this territory for 40 years, and I've seen plenty of men like you come and go. They all think money and connections can override legal rights, but there's one thing you haven't considered. And what's that, madam? The people. Constance gestured toward the crowd of miners and prospectors who had gathered to watch the confrontation. These folks may not have fancy lawyers or political connections, but they understand what it means when a man's word and legal deed count for nothing. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Morrison's expression tightened as he realized that public opinion was turning against him. Furthermore, Delilah added, stepping forward with a document of her own, your own surveyor made an error in his land description. According to this map, you're claiming mineral rights that extend into Cedar Creek, which is territorial water and can't be privately owned. Morrison's legal assistant grabbed the survey map and examined it frantically. After a moment, he leaned over to whisper urgently in Morrison's ear. The mining company manager's face darkened as he realized his legal position was weaker than he had expected. This is a temporary setback, Morrison announced, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. We'll be back with corrected documents and proper territorial authority. You do that, Cyrus replied calmly. But when you come back, make sure you bring proof of legitimate ownership. Because I'll be defending my family's land, and I don't plan to lose. The sword at his side caught the morning sunlight, its polished blade sending flashes of light across the assembled crowd. The completed weapon represented everything the Blackwell family had fought to preserve: craftsmanship, determination, and the willingness to defend what was rightfully theirs. Morrison and his men withdrew, but everyone understood this was only the first engagement in what would be a longer battle. Morrison returned 3 days later with twice as many men, and what he claimed was unassailable legal authority from the territorial government. But he also returned to find that Cyrus had not been idle during the intervening time. The mining camp had been transformed into something approaching a fortress, with strategic positions prepared, and the entire community united in defense of their homes. More importantly, Cyrus had discovered Jeremiah's master key hidden in the family Bible, a symbolic key that unlocked a strongbox containing documents that would prove devastating to the mining company's case. The strongbox had been buried beneath the forge at the original homestead, placed there by their father as insurance against exactly this kind of legal challenge. "Mr. Blackwell," Morrison called out as his enlarged force took positions around the camp. "I trust you've had time to reconsider our generous offer." "I have indeed," Cyrus replied, emerging from behind a stone barricade with Delilah at his side and Constance seated safely but visibly nearby. "And I've discovered some interesting information about Consolidated Mining's claims." He held up a thick folder of documents. "These are the original territorial surveys from 1848, along with mineral rights assessments that were filed with the territorial government when my father first claimed this land. According to these records, the mineral rights you think you purchased from my brother were never legally separable from the surface rights." Morrison's legal assistant reached for the documents, but Cyrus pulled them back. "More interesting, is this a record of bribes paid by Consolidated Mining to territorial officials, along with forged documents used to support fraudulent land claims in 3 other territories." The crowd of miners and prospectors pressed closer, their anger growing as they realized they had been victims of a systematic fraud. Several men called out questions about their own land claims, wondering if they too had been cheated. "Those documents are fabricated," Morrison declared, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Consolidated Mining operates within full legal authority." "Do you?" Delilah stepped forward, her own evidence in hand. "Because I've been researching your company's history, Mr. Morrison. It turns out that Consolidated Mining has been using the same fraudulent tactics across the Western Territories for the past 5 years. The Territorial Attorney General is very interested in talking to you." She gestured toward the road leading into camp, where a small group of riders approached under the authority of territorial law. The lead rider wore the badge of a territorial marshal, and his presence changed the dynamics of the confrontation completely. "Bradford Morrison," the marshal called out as he dismounted, "you're under arrest for fraud, bribery of government officials, and conspiracy to steal territorial lands." The mining company's armed men looked uncertainly at their employer, clearly unwilling to resist legitimate territorial authority. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, before settling into resignation. "This isn't over," he said to Cyrus as the marshal approached with handcuffs. "Consolidated Mining has resources you can't imagine." "Maybe," Cyrus replied calmly, "but they don't have family. They don't have people willing to stand up for what's right. And they don't have this." He drew the completed ceremonial sword, its blade catching the afternoon light in a way that seemed almost magical. The weapon represented everything Morrison's company lacked: patience, craftsmanship, family loyalty, and the willingness to defend principles rather than simply pursuing profit. "That sword was made by 3 generations of Blackwells working together," Delilah added. "It represents something your company will never understand, that some things are more valuable than money." As the marshal led Morrison away and his men dispersed, the residents of the mining camp began to celebrate. They had faced down corporate intimidation and government corruption, proving that ordinary people could still defend their rights when they stood together. But for the Blackwell family, the victory meant something even more important. They had not only saved their land, they had reclaimed their identity as a family, united by shared values and mutual support. "Your father would be proud," Constance said to Delilah as they watched the last of the mining company's forces withdraw. "He always believed that family was stronger than any outside force, as long as they stood together." "What happens now?" Delilah asked, looking between Cyrus and her grandmother. "Now we go home," Cyrus replied, the word home carrying weight and meaning it hadn't held for 30 years. "We rebuild the homestead, we establish a proper smithy, and we create the kind of life your father always hoped we could have together." The master key that had unlocked their father's strongbox hung from a chain around Cyrus's neck, a reminder that families sometimes need to unlock old secrets to move forward together. But the real key to their future was simpler: the willingness to choose forgiveness over pride, unity over independence, and love over fear. As the sun set behind the mountains, the Blackwell family began planning not just their return to the homestead, but their future as a family reunited by crisis and strengthened by the shared understanding that they were stronger together than any of them could be alone. 6 months after the confrontation at Broken Creek, the Blackwell homestead had been transformed from a solitary retreat into a thriving family operation. The sound that had been missing for 30 years, the ring of hammer against anvil, once again echoed across the mountain valley as Delilah worked at the forge her father and uncle had built together in their youth. The new family portrait sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece of the expanded cabin, showing 3 generations of Blackwells standing together against the backdrop of Colorado mountains. Cyrus had commissioned the photograph from a traveling artist who specialized in family portraits, wanting to create a visual record of their reunification that could be passed down to future generations. In the portrait, Constance sat in a comfortable chair, her health much improved after months of proper care and mountain air. Delilah stood behind her with one hand resting protectively on her grandmother's shoulder, wearing the leather apron that had belonged to her father and carrying the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. Cyrus stood to the side, his weathered face showing the peace that comes from finally being able to call a place home rather than simply shelter. But it was what couldn't be seen in the photograph that mattered most: the conversations around the dinner table, where 3 decades of separation were slowly being bridged with shared stories, the quiet moments when Cyrus helped Constance with her daily walks, and the hours spent in the forge where uncle and niece worked together to fill orders that now came from settlements across the territory. "Uncle Cyrus," Delilah called from the forge, "could you look at this joint? I want to make sure I'm getting the Damascus pattern the way Father intended." Cyrus set down the letter. He had been writing correspondence with other scattered family members who had begun reaching out after news of the reunification spread through the family network, and walked to where Delilah was working on a commission piece. The blade she was forging showed the distinctive wavy pattern of Damascus steel, created by folding and welding different types of metal together. It was one of the most challenging techniques in blacksmithing, requiring not just skill, but an intuitive understanding of how different metals behaved under heat and pressure. "The pattern looks perfect," Cyrus said, examining her work with genuine admiration. "Your father would be amazed at how quickly you've mastered techniques that took him years to develop." "I had a good teacher," Delilah replied with a smile, "and I had his notes to work from." She gestured toward Jeremiah's work journal, which now sat permanently open on a reading stand near the forge. The notebook had become their guide for recreating techniques and completing projects that Jeremiah had planned but never finished. It was also their way of keeping his presence alive in the work they did together. "There's something I want to show you," Cyrus said, leading Delilah to a wooden chest that sat near the forge. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were dozens of metal objects: knives, tools, decorative pieces, and small sculptures that represented 30 years of solitary work. "I made all of these during the years I lived alone," he explained. "I kept telling myself I was just maintaining the forge, keeping my skills sharp in case I ever needed them. But I think I was really trying to stay connected to the family craft, even when I was too proud to admit it." Delilah picked up a small knife with an intricately carved handle, noting the quality of the workmanship and the attention to detail. "These are beautiful, Uncle Cyrus. Why did you never show them to anyone?" "Because I was ashamed. I thought I had given up the right to call myself part of the family tradition when I drove your father away." He paused, watching her examine the pieces. "But now I think they represent something else, proof that family connections are stronger than pride or distance or even time." From the cabin, they could hear Constance's voice as she read aloud from one of the letters that had been arriving regularly since word of their story spread. Family members they had never met, Descendants of relatives who had moved to other territories were reaching out to reconnect and share their own family histories. "Your cousin, Margaret, writes that she's planning to visit next summer," Constance called to them. "She's bringing her children so they can meet their Blackwell relatives." The prospect of an even larger family reunion filled Cyrus with a contentment he had never expected to feel. For 30 years, he had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the complications that came with family relationships. Now, he understood that those complications were actually the source of life's richest satisfactions. The original knife that had brought them together, the one Delilah had sold to him in the canyon, now hung in a shadow box on the wall of their combined workshop. It had been cleaned and polished, and a small brass plaque beneath it read, "In memory of Jeremiah Blackwell, master craftsman and beloved brother." Some gifts are worth more than the price paid for them. As evening approached, the three of them gathered for dinner, as had become their custom. Constance offered the blessing, thanking God for bringing family together and asking for continued health and wisdom. Delilah shared news from the territory orders they had received, neighbors who had stopped by, developments in the ongoing legal troubles of Consolidated Mining Company. Cyrus found himself mostly listening, content to hear the voices of family filling a home that had been silent for too many years. The transformation was complete, not just of the homestead, but of himself. He was no longer the bitter, isolated man who had chosen pride over love. He was Uncle Cyrus, family patriarch, keeper of traditions, and guardian of the next generation's dreams. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Delilah mentioned that she had been thinking about expanding their workshop to include a teaching space. "There are young people in the territory who want to learn metalworking," she said. "Maybe we could start a school, pass on Father's techniques to a new generation." "I think your father would love that idea," Cyrus replied, remembering Jeremiah's passion for teaching and his belief that knowledge should be shared, rather than hoarded. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the winter season. But inside the Blackwell homestead, 3 generations of family were planning for spring, for growth, for the future they would build together on the foundation of forgiveness, skill, and enduring love.